curled up, and on today's episode I'm going to talk about Ishmael by Daniel Quinn, originally published in 1992, and it is a philosophy book. It's one of my favorites. I actually ran into this book for the first time in an anthropology class in college and fell in love with it, and I've returned to it a few times since then, and I think it's really accessible and a great book for anyone to read. It did win an award. It won the Turner Tomorrow Fellowship Award, actually before it was published in 1991. It was also briefly in the public view in 2010 when James J. Lee had a standoff with police and was killed outside the headquarters of the Discovery Channel TV station. He was a fanatic, a very fervent environmentalist who really went a little too far with the book and believed in a lot of its teachings and then a lot of other things on his own, and kind of used it to rationalize his point of view. But anyway, don't let that scare you off. Certainly not something I would expect from most people. It is a fantastic book, so let's dive right in. Okay, so to get into what this book is about, I'd like to read a line from the book. It's actually a snippet of a newspaper ad that kind of sets the whole book in motion. The main character of the book is an unnamed narrator, and I don't know why Quinn chose to leave him unnamed. I think partially it was to make him a bit more relatable so that you could kind of see yourself in his position. And so that his character didn't really get in the way of the message of the book. He's kind of an everyman. So the main character, the nameless main character, is or was in the 60s a member of the counterculture movement, and then he kind of grew up and grew out of those childish ideas and kind of joined the real world as he sees it, which I think a lot of us can relate with. Where, some people feel that they're very idealistic when they're younger and feel that they can change the world or save the world in some way, and then they end up growing up, getting a job, a house, 2 kids, a mortgage, and it goes from there. And I think a lot of people could probably relate to how he feels at the opening of this book. And he opens his newspaper one morning and reads the following ad. It says, "Teacher seeks pupil, must have an earnest desire to save the world, apply in person." And the ad initially just pisses him off because it seems like the exact kind of garbage that drew him in and made him waste his childhood being idealistic, and then the subsequent disappointment that he felt later in life. And so he marches down to the address listed, honestly expecting to just kind of give this person a piece of his mind, expecting someone who was going to self-stylize as sort of a New Age Gandhi figure and have, cultish followers fawning all over him. He doesn't find any of that. What he finds is it's in a very nondescript office building. He walks into a room and all he sees is, I believe, two-way glass when he first gets in the room. Or maybe just glass with a dark room behind it. I can't quite recall. But he thinks he's alone. He gets upset again and feels like he's been duped and feels stupid for even showing up. And then he realizes that there's someone behind the glass staring back at him, and it takes him a moment to realize, and this is the part of the book that some people find difficult, it's actually a gorilla. Ishmael is the name of the other character in this book, and Ishmael is a gorilla. He started his life in Africa, was captured and brought over and put in a zoo, and eventually taken in by an individual who... he seems like kind of a Coco character, like the gorilla Coco who learned sign language. He was domesticated, and of course went much further than that and began to read and eventually communicate. So it is something that you do kind of have to suspend disbelief for. It's a talking gorilla. It's actually a gorilla speaking telepathically, which I know is difficult, but it really does kind of open the avenue of communication between the two, and obviously with Ishmael being a gorilla, it's supposed to give him kind of that opposite perspective of mankind. So Ishmael begins talking with the narrator. They eventually begin sort of a teacher-student relationship where the narrator simply just sits in this room and discusses society with Ishmael. And Ishmael asks him questions that bring to light ideas of sustainability and kind of challenge the anthropocentric worldview that a lot of Western or westernized nations have. So in a very basic sense, Ishmael and the narrator discuss modern society, how we've gotten where we are currently, and how that differs from the majority of human history. Ishmael heavily uses the Socratic method to discuss this with the narrator. He asks open-ended questions that the narrator has to kind of search for answers for, and some of them are difficult to answer. They're things that you never consider until asked. It's like a child asking you, why is the sky blue? The sky just is blue. Of course, there's a reason for it. Most of us don't ever think of it or know it, and you kind of have to do a little digging to find the answer. And that's what Ishmael's doing. He's asking the narrator questions about modern society that force him to stop and look at his life and other lives in Western society in a way that he had not done so previously. The idea of man as keeper of the earth, which is an idea that's very popularized in Western culture, especially Western Judeo-Christian culture, where, it's heavily accepted that man was kind of gifted the earth to take care of and sort of be the groundskeeper, if you will. He talks about how that idea is positive in the sense that it makes us feel we have a responsibility to preserve the earth, but also how it can be negative in the sense that it makes us feel like we own the earth and we are sort of its lord and master and can do what we will with it, even if that is destroying it to our own detriment. So a lot of ideas revolving around not just environmentalism, but, cultural, not evolution, that's not really a term that's even really accepted in anthropological circles these days. So basically Ishmael calls into question, or has the narrator call into question, a lot of ideas that he's always held as just the way that things are, and why they have become that way, how they got there, and how they might need to change if humanity is to continue to live on planet Earth, especially for any greater length of time. As far as the end of the book, this book raises a lot of questions, and for a lot of people, they're uncomfortable questions, and questions that are even more difficult. They raise problems that are difficult to find a solution for, things that you hadn't realized really maybe were an issue until you stop and think about it. And then you don't really know how to solve that issue because it's so ingrained in modern society. And so one thing that people get frustrated with this book for is that they feel like it raises a lot of questions, but doesn't necessarily give distinct answers, which of course in this situation there are no easy answers. And I don't really want to say much more because I feel like I would give too much of the book away and too much of the discovery that you take on with the narrator as far as following his logic. As far as who I would recommend this book for, I think this is a great book for kids, to be honest, because the Socratic method that Ishmael uses is extremely easy to follow, can even feel repetitive or slow at some parts, like he's taking things in too small of steps, and if you're comfortable with philosophy and making leaps like that, it can seem like he's moving very slowly, but he's really walking you step by step through this idea that he's trying to convey, which I think makes it great for kids of maybe middle school age, or even, depending on the kid, a little bit earlier or later. But I think that it's a book that kids definitely should read because it does teach them to kind of step outside the bounds of society and look at the world in a way that they maybe wouldn't otherwise and wouldn't be taught to otherwise. So I think that is a great option there if you have a child that you think is up to the challenge of kind of thinking outside the box in that way. It's also a book, though, that you do have to have a kind of a basic understanding of the idea of evolution, and also an acceptance of that idea. If you're not comfortable with the idea of evolution, probably not the best book for you, and that's fine. But if you are interested, if you find this an enjoyable read, there are luckily a couple more books. It's actually a trilogy. The second one being called The Story of B, and the third one is My Ishmael. Now, I actually have not read those two, surprisingly, I know. I do intend to eventually. Now, there is a short nonfiction, I guess we could call it a long essay, written by Daniel Quinn years and years after this book was published, called Beyond Civilization. And it's completely nonfiction. It doesn't have the sort of, fictional skeleton that this one does to hold up the bones of the work. It's really just an essay and on his philosophy. And it does kind of represent and clarify some of the ideas presented in Ishmael, as well as provide what he thinks would be the answers for some of the questions he raises. So if you do get frustrated and you feel like this book doesn't quite delve deep enough into what can be done as a society for us to kind of start to change things and go in the right direction with the issues that he raises, then you might find Beyond Civilization to be a very enlightening read. And he also has an autobiography that touches on a lot of that as well. So overall, I obviously have very positive feelings about this book. It raised a lot of questions for me that I hadn't asked myself before, or at least had not articulated. Kind of took things that were just sort of a feeling and gave them a voice, which was very refreshing. It was also quite early in my anthropological major that I read this, and so it kind of was a framework for the way that I viewed culture in general through the rest of my studies, which was fantastic. It's definitely a book that I would recommend. As I said at the beginning of the video, I've recommended it to friends and family and probably pestered them to read it more than I should, just because I think it is so valuable for people of all ages and any cultural background. It's something that applies, I think, cross-culturally, mostly, of course, to kind of industrialized modern Western societies, but certainly to the rest of the world in general, especially as they are being affected by our society. Anyway, the book, again, is Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. I hope that you'll all give it a try, and I know that it's a bit controversial, so I'm sure that you'll have plenty to say in the comments, both negative and positive. Either way, I look forward to hearing from you. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Love to address them in a future video, and thanks for stopping by.